Through the dim window washed in twilight, Jack froze as he saw a strange man holding his daughter with unmistakable intimacy. And Lydia, his wife, stood beside them, her gaze cold, as if he had never existed. 9 months on the battlefield had never made him flinch, but in that moment, inside his own home, Jack understood that the fiercest battle of his life had just begun. The old Ford turned onto the familiar road as dusk settled in. Jack tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his eyes lighting up when the small house appeared behind the line of maple trees, 9 months apart. And now, he was home. He shut off the engine and sat still for a moment in silence. His hands still trembled slightly, a lingering effect of sleepless nights and gunfire echoing in his memory. But today, he chose to set all of that aside. Today was the day he would hold his daughter. She was 18 months old now, surely she must be toddling around by this point. He stepped out of the car, the weight of his pack still heavy on his shoulders. Each step toward the front door matched the eager pounding in his chest. He had planned this moment hundreds of times. He would kneel down, open his arms wide, and let Emma run straight into them, just as he had dreamed every night in that far-off place. But the moment he crossed the threshold, Jack's world stopped turning. Eric, a complete stranger, was standing by the window. In his arms was Emma, his daughter. She was laughing, her tiny hand patting Eric's cheek in a gesture of intimacy that cut straight through Jack's heart. And Lydia, his wife, was standing there too, but her eyes were cold, as though she had never known him at all. Jack stood frozen. His shoulders were rigid, his jaw clenched tight, yet his feet would not carry him forward another inch. "Jack," Lydia spoke at last, "I thought you weren't back yet." Those words were like salt rubbed into an open wound. Not "I missed you," not "welcome home," just a flat observation about timing. I wanted to come home early to see Emma," Jack said, his voice hoarse. His eyes were locked on the child in Eric's arms. His hand lifted instinctively, reaching for her, then stopped in midair. Eric looked at Jack, a polite smile forming on his lips. "She's adorable, isn't she?" he said to Lydia, completely ignoring Jack's presence, as if Jack were nothing more than a shadow. Emma giggled, her little fingers clutching at Eric's jacket, and that was enough. For Jack, it was the collapse of an entire belief system. He had left his family behind to protect sacred values, freedom, security, the happiness of the people he loved. And now, the very home he had shed sweat and tears to defend was the place where he had become expendable. May I hold Emma?" Jack asked, his voice trembling so badly he could hear it breaking apart with every syllable. Lydia hesitated, then gave a slight nod. She stepped forward and took Emma from Eric's arms. But when she turned toward Jack, there was a different look in her eyes, one of calculation, of uncertainty. Jack opened his arms. Emma looked at him. Her wide eyes were curious, but there was no spark of recognition. She reached back toward Lydia and called out, "Mommy." Then, as if frightened by something she could not name, she turned her face away, refusing to go to Jack. In that instant, Jack's world collapsed completely. He did not shout. He did not grab Eric by the collar. He did not ask Lydia why. He simply stood there, his arms still outstretched, like a stone statue cracked down the middle. Slowly, he lowered his hands. "All right," Jack whispered, his voice cold as a winter wind. "I don't want to scare her." Eric glanced at his watch and spoke up. "I should get going. See you again, Lydia." "Thank you for stopping by." Lydia replied warmly, a warmth Jack no longer heard in her voice. As the sound of Eric's car faded down the driveway, Jack remained standing in the doorway, staring out into the gathering darkness, and he felt himself sinking into it as well. Not long afterward, Lydia set a suitcase down on the floor with a soft thud. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I can't keep living like this anymore." Jack sat on the sofa, his hands braced against his head. He didn't look at her. He couldn't, because if he did, he was afraid he would beg. "What about Emma?" Jack asked, his voice thick and rough. "She's too young, Lydia. She needs her mother." Lydia hesitated, then shook her head. I know I'm being selfish, but I need to live for myself too. Eric, he understands me. He's here, not somewhere far away that I can't reach." Each word pierced Jack's heart like a needle. He wanted to shout that he had been gone out of duty to his country, to his family, to this very home. But the words lodged in his throat and would not come out. "I'll take care of Emma," Jack said at last. Lydia stood still for a moment, then turned away, Her footsteps echoed across the tile floor, each step an unspoken farewell. When the door finally closed, Jack remained seated, staring into empty space. Then, from the bedroom, came a small cry. "Emma!" Jack rose to his feet, his legs unsteady. He had faced countless trials in his life, dangerous missions, impossible decisions, but stepping into his daughter's room, he felt more lost than ever. Emma lay in her white crib, her small face flushed red. She was crying not in sharp wails, but in broken sobs, as if she were searching for something she could not find. "Mommy, Mommy," she whispered through her tears. Jack stood beside the crib, his hands trembling. "Emma," he said softly, his voice barely above a breath, as though afraid of breaking something fragile. Daddy's here now." But Emma kept crying. She turned away, searching for the familiar warmth of the mother who was gone. Jack bent down and carefully lifted her into his arms. His movements were awkward, like someone learning to walk for the first time. He held her close, but she still squirmed, her tiny arms and legs moving restlessly. "It's all right," Jack whispered, his voice shaking. "I'll take care of you. I promise." He began to walk slowly around the room, his footsteps soft against the wooden floor. He held Emma to his chest, feeling her small breaths rise and fall. It was one of the hardest nights Jack had ever known. When his eyes closed, images flooded in distant echoes, flashes of fire tearing through the night, shouting, "Dust," and faces he had not been able to save. Around 3 in the morning, Emma began to cry again. This time, the cries lingered, as if she were searching for an answer to her mother's absence. Jack sank down onto the floor, his back resting against the crib. He lifted Emma onto his lap and looked steadily at her small face. "You know," he said, his voice trembling, "Daddy's scared. I'm afraid I'll hurt you. I'm afraid my hands are too rough, too calloused. But I'll learn. I'll learn how to hold you gently. I'll learn how to be a father. I love you." As if sensing the sincerity in his words, Emma slowly stopped crying. Her wide eyes looked up at him. Then, like a small miracle, she reached out and wrapped her hand around Jack's index finger. That finger, thick, calloused, marked by years of hardship, now became an anchor for a tiny life. Jack felt the warmth of her grip. Tears welled in his eyes, but he held them back. He didn't want Emma to see her father break. "I promise you," Jack whispered, his voice steadier now. "I can lose everything. I can lose my home, my wife, even myself. But I will never lose you. You are the only reason I keep going." Emma pressed her lips together, then slowly closed her eyes. Her breathing evened out, her small hand still clutching Jack's finger like a silent vow. Jack stayed perfectly still, afraid to move. Moonlight filtered softly through the window, casting light on 2 figures, a wounded man and a child searching for safety. And in that darkness, a vow was formed. No words spoken, no papers signed, just a broken man deciding to give everything he had left to protect the one thing that still mattered. When the first hint of dawn appeared, Jack was still there, his back against the crib, Emma sleeping peacefully in his arms. His eyes were swollen, his face worn with exhaustion, but in his gaze, a small flame had begun to burn, a flame called hope. The first week as a single father swept by like a whirlwind. Jack learned how to mix formula, measuring each scoop carefully, checking the temperature on his wrist, just as the online instructions advised. He learned how to change diapers, clumsy at first, taking a full 15 minutes the very first time, but by the 5th day he had cut it down to 5. He learned how to sing lullabies, his voice rough and gravelly, far from melodic, yet Emma seemed to like it. Every morning, Jack woke to Emma calling from her crib. He lifted her up, gently stroked her soft hair, and silently promised, "Today will be better than yesterday, sweetheart." But there was one thing that kept him uneasy. Lydia. She called twice, but her voice felt distant, as though she was speaking to an old acquaintance rather than someone she had once shared a bed with. And whenever Emma was mentioned, her questions were brief and perfunctory, as if she were merely fulfilling an obligation. Jack knew something was wrong. On Saturday afternoon, Jack placed Emma in her stroller and went to the law office of Sarah Mitchell, an old friend from high school. Sarah was a sharp woman, her hair cut short, her eyes always seeming to see straight through to the truth. "Jack, it's been a long time," Sarah said with a smile as she stepped into the reception room. But the smile faded quickly when she saw the look in Jack's eyes heavy with worry. "I need your help," Jack said plainly. "Lydia left me. She's involved with another man, Eric Sanders, and I feel like something is very wrong." Sarah nodded and opened her laptop. Eric Sanders? Let me check. For the next few minutes, Jack sat motionless, watching Sarah's every movement. Emma lay in her stroller, playing with a small stuffed bear. Her soft giggles were the only sound in the quiet room. I found him, Sarah finally said, her voice lowering. Eric Sanders, 42 years old. Not a clean record. He was investigated for financial fraud in the past, but there wasn't enough evidence to convict. It appears he specializes in targeting single women or women in troubled marriages, then persuading them to sign contracts that benefit him. Jack felt like a stone dropped into his stomach. You're saying fraud? Yes, Sarah said with a nod. He's careful. He doesn't do anything blatant. He usually uses emotional manipulation, getting victims to voluntarily hand over assets or sign collateral agreements. Once everything is done, he disappears. Jack gripped the armrest of his chair, his jaw tightening. Lydia, has she had any financial dealings with him? Sarah typed a few more keystrokes, then looked up. I can't access personal details, but if you suspect something, you should check your family's financial documents. The house, bank accounts. Look for anything unusual. Jack stood and lifted Emma into his arms. Thank you, Sarah. I'll look into it right away. Jack, Sarah called after him as he reached the door. Be careful. If he really is a con artist, you'll need solid evidence before you do anything. Jack nodded, but inside him, anger had already begun to burn. Back home, Jack placed Emma in her crib and began rummaging through the filing cabinets. His hands trembled slightly as he opened each folder. Utility bills, savings accounts, insurance papers. And then, at the very bottom, he found it. A home mortgage agreement. Jack read every line, his eyes widening. The house he and Lydia had bought with their savings, the house he had promised would be Emma's safe haven, had been put up as collateral. The beneficiary was not a bank, but a private financial company called Sanders Investment Group. The signature at the bottom was Lydia's. Date signed, 2 weeks earlier. Jack set the paper down, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He sank to the floor, knees drawn up, his head cradled in his hands. But even then, his mind snapped into focus. The threat, Eric Sanders. A con man slowly devouring his family's assets. Resources, Sarah who could provide legal guidance. Time because Eric had not yet completed the process. The plan, find proof, stop Lydia before it was too late, protect Emma. Jack stood up, his expression resolute. He walked into Emma's room and looked at her sleeping peacefully in her crib. He gently laid his hand on her head, stroking her soft hair. Sleep peacefully, he whispered, his voice low and steady with resolve. Daddy won't let anyone take this house away. This is your fortress. And a soldier, even one who has fallen, will protect the fortress until his very last breath. The address Sarah provided led Jack to a small apartment on the outskirts of the city. The building was old, the paint peeling, but it was clean. Jack parked the car, lifted Emma into his arms, and climbed to the 3rd floor, following the number Sarah had written down. The door opened. A woman of about 35 appeared. Clara Sanders. Long brown hair fell over her shoulders, her eyes tired but still sharp. She wore a simple sweater and held a thick folder of documents in her arms. You're Jack Reynolds, aren't you? Clara asked, her voice calm but slightly guarded. Yes, I'm Jack, he replied. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Clara nodded and looked down at Emma. Her expression softened. She's adorable. Please come in. The apartment was small, with a combined living room and kitchen, and 1 bedroom. Clara gestured toward the sofa. Have a seat. I'll make some coffee. Jack sat down, settling Emma on his lap. The little girl sat upright, her eyes roaming the room with a child's curiosity. Jack gently smoothed her hair, trying to keep her calm. Clara returned with 2 cups of coffee and set them on the table. She sat across from Jack and looked at him directly. You came here because of Eric, didn't you? Jack nodded. I understand you're his wife, or his ex-wife. Clara gave a bitter smile. Legally, we're still married, but Eric left 6 months ago. He said he was going on a business trip, but I knew he was hunting for a new target. Hunting? Clara nodded and opened the folder. Eric is very good at what he does. He looks for women who are vulnerable, divorced, widowed, or whose husbands are away for long periods. He approaches them, builds trust, then persuades them to sign financial agreements. Once he's taken what he wants, he disappears. So Lydia, my wife, she's being deceived by him? Very likely, Clara said, her voice lowering. I've been tracking Eric for the past 3 months, I know where he's been and what he's doing, but I don't have enough solid evidence to take him to court. He's clever. He knows how to cover his tracks. Jack clenched his fists. But I do have evidence. I found the paperwork for a home collateral agreement. The beneficiary is his company. Clara looked up, her eyes lighting up. Did you bring the documents with you? Jack pulled the folder from his backpack and placed it on the table. Clara reviewed it, her eyes moving quickly across the pages. Then she let out a slow breath. This is clear evidence. If we combine this with what I have, we may be able to stop him. We? Jack asked, surprised. Clara nodded. I'm a victim too. Eric took my family's assets and caused my parents to lose their home. They're living with relatives now. I want him to pay. Jack looked at Clara. In her eyes, he saw the same pain he carried himself. The pain of betrayal, of being deceived. But she had not surrendered to despair. She was still fighting. Do you have a plan? Jack asked. Clara nodded. I've contacted a private investigator. We need stronger proof recordings, video, or clear evidence of financial transactions. If you're willing, we can work together. Jack didn't hesitate. I am. For Emma. He looked down at his daughter, who was now playing with a sheet of paper on the table, gripping it and crumpling it with innocent delight. Clara smiled faintly as she watched Emma. She's lovely. You're lucky. Jack nodded, his voice tightening. She's all I have left. I can't let Eric take her home away. Clara placed a hand on Jack's shoulder, a gentle, reassuring gesture. We'll stop him, I promise. For the next hour, Jack and Clara sat together, organizing the evidence. They compared documents, listed suspicious transactions, and mapped out a plan to approach Lydia and persuade her before it was too late. Meanwhile, Emma sat on Jack's lap, clutching papers, crumpling them and tossing them to the floor. She giggled each time a sheet fluttered up and fell down. Her laughter was like a cool breeze, easing the tension in the room. Jack looked at his daughter, his heart warming. He realized that no matter how dark life became, Emma was still his guiding light. She knew nothing of schemes or betrayal. She only knew how to laugh, how to trust, how to love. You know, Clara said softly, when I look at her, I feel hope. We're not fighting out of hatred. We're fighting for children like this, for innocent lives that need to be protected. Jack nodded, tears threatening to rise, but he held them back. That's right. I don't want Emma to grow up in a world where adults only deceive and betray one another. I want her to know that her father fought for her and didn't give up. Clara smiled. And she'll be proud of you. Emma lifted her head, looked at Jack, and broke into a wide grin. She reached up and touched his cheek, just as she had when he first knocked on the door. Jack held her close and kissed her forehead. Thank you, Emma, he whispered. You're the reason I won't give up. Clara stood and gathered the papers. So let's meet again next week. I'll stay in touch with the investigator, and you try to find a way to reach Lydia. But be careful, don't let Eric know you're looking into him. Jack nodded. I understand. I'll be careful. As Jack stepped out of the apartment, he felt lighter. He was no longer alone. He had Clara, an ally, someone who understood his pain, and most importantly, he had Emma, the reason he would keep moving forward. The upscale restaurant in the heart of the city, the place where Eric had arranged to meet Lydia to finalize the last paperwork. Warm golden light spilled over tables dressed in crisp white linens, soft music drifting gently through the air. Everything looked perfect, a carefully staged set for the final act of a well-rehearsed con. Jack sat in a distant corner, dressed in a simple shirt, his hair neatly combed. Beside him stood Emma's stroller. She was fast asleep, unaware of the storm about to break. Jack glanced at her, resting his hand lightly on the edge of the stroller, an instinctive, protective gesture. Clara sat at another table, wearing a tailored suit, her hair pinned neatly back. She held a cup of coffee, but her eyes never left the entrance. The two exchanged a subtle nod, a signal that they were ready. The restaurant door opened. Lydia walked in. She wore an elegant black dress, her softly curled hair falling loosely over her shoulders. Her face glowed, like someone stepping into a promised new future. Behind her was Eric. He wore a grey suit, his tie perfectly straight, a courteous smile fixed on his lips. Every movement was polished like a seasoned actor playing his role. Eric and Lydia took their seats at a table in the center of the restaurant. Eric ordered wine, opened a sleek leather briefcase, and laid out several documents. You just need to sign here, he said, his voice sweet as honey. And everything will belong to us. Lydia smiled and picked up the pen. I trust you, Eric. At that moment, Jack stood up. He walked forward, each step steady, measured, like the beat of a drum. Eyes throughout the restaurant turned toward him, the tall, broad-shouldered man with a grave expression. "Lydia," Jack called, his voice low, calm, and commanding. Lydia startled and turned around, her face drained of color. "Jack, why are you here?" Eric frowned, his eyes flicking toward Jack with caution. "What do you think you're doing?" Jack didn't answer. He looked straight at Eric, then turned to Lydia. "What are you about to sign?" Lydia hesitated. It's an investment contract. Eric is going to help you lose the house." Jack cut in, his voice frighteningly calm. "Help you lose everything. And then he'll disappear just like he's done to dozens of other women." Eric stood up. The polite smile was still there, but his eyes had turned cold. "What are you talking about? I think you're mistaken." "I'm not mistaken, Eric Sanders," Jack said, enunciating every word. "Or should I call you Matthew Green? Or David Cooper? How many names have you used?" Eric's face went pale. He glanced toward the door, calculating his escape. At that moment, Clara rose from her table and walked over. She placed a thick folder on the table between Eric and Lydia. "This is the evidence," she said, her voice calm but razor-sharp. 12 victims over the past 3 years, all defrauded the same way you're trying to defraud Lydia." Lydia stared at the folder, her hands trembling. "No, that's not possible." Clara opened the first page. "This is Mrs. Helen Carter lost her home in 2022. This is Miss Rebecca lost her savings in 2023. And this," she turned to the final page, "this is my mother. She lost her house because she trusted you." Eric stepped back, his face ashen. You don't have any proof." "We do," Jack said, pulling out his phone and pressing play. Eric's voice filled the air, smooth words of persuasion, false promises, and most damning of all, a recorded admission to an accomplice about his plan to seize Lydia's assets. When the recording ended, Lydia covered her face with both hands. Her shoulders shook violently. "No, this can't be true. Eric, tell me this isn't true." Eric said nothing. He turned and tried to flee, but the restaurant doors opened and 2 police officers stepped inside. Behind them was Sarah Mitchell, the attorney, her expression stern. "Eric Sanders," one officer said, "you are under arrest for financial fraud. You have the right to remain silent." Eric struggled, but the officers quickly restrained him. The sharp click of handcuffs echoed through the silent restaurant. Every eye was fixed on the scene. Jack stood still, watching. He felt no triumph, none of the rush he'd known in combat, only a bone-deep exhaustion, as though an enormous weight had finally been lifted, leaving behind a deep hollow in his soul. Lydia turned toward Jack, tears streaming down her face. "Jack, I'm sorry. I was wrong. But Jack didn't look at her. He turned away and walked back to Emma's stroller. She was still sleeping peacefully, unaware of the chaos around her. Lydia hurried after him, her voice trembling. "Jack, please forgive me. I was blind. I didn't know." Jack stopped, but he didn't turn around. "Emma is sleeping," he said quietly, his voice cold. "Don't wake her." Then he straightened, placing himself firmly between Lydia and the stroller, a solid barrier. This young father, broad-shouldered and resolute, became a shield protecting his child's sleep from the turmoil of the adult world. Lydia stood there, her arms half extended, unable to move closer. She sobbed softly, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to see her." "No," Jack said, his voice final. "You gave up that right when you chose to leave. Emma needs a safe home, and I will give her that." Sarah stepped forward and placed a hand on Lydia's shoulder. "You should go. We'll talk later." Lydia looked at Jack one last time, then turned away, her steps unsteady, like someone hollowed out from within. When everyone had left, the restaurant grew quiet again. Jack sat down beside the stroller, resting his hand on its edge, gently stroking it. Emma stirred slightly, then drifted back to sleep. Clara walked over and sat beside him. "Are you okay?" Jack nodded but didn't speak. He just looked at Emma, his expression softening. "You did the right thing," Clara said gently. "She'll be proud of you." Jack gave a faint smile, the first in many painful days. "I hope so." And in that moment, Jack knew that although the battle was over, his real journey was only just beginning. But he was ready. For Emma. For her future. The divorce papers lay on the table. Jack sat staring at them, his hands trembling slightly. He had kept the house, been granted full custody of Emma, with Lydia allowed only supervised visitation. Legally speaking, he was the victor. So why did he feel so empty inside? Jack stood and walked into Emma's room. She lay in her crib, her cheeks rosy, her arms wrapped tightly around a stuffed bear. He sat down beside her, looking at his daughter with a troubled gaze. "Did I do the right thing, sweetheart?" he whispered. "I protected you. But why does it feel like I destroyed everything?" Emma didn't answer. Of course she didn't. Jack sighed and rested a hand on his forehead. Sleep had been hard to come by lately. Every time he closed his eyes, images rushed back not only from the battlefield, but from Lydia's shattered expression when she learned the truth. The look in her eyes, then a mix of pain, shame, and despair haunted him relentlessly. Was I too cruel? Jack asked himself. Lydia was wrong, but she was a victim too. Should I have forgiven her? Then he looked at Emma, and the answer became clear. Not out of hatred, not to punish Lydia, but because Emma needed a stable home, one not built on empty promises. Still, the emptiness did not fade. A week later, rain poured over the city like tears from the sky. Jack sat in the living room, listening to the rain tapping against the windows. Emma was playing on the rug, stacking wooden blocks and knocking them down, giggling every time they collapsed with a clatter. But that afternoon, something wasn't right. Emma became fussy. She stopped playing and sat clutching her stuffed bear, her face flushed. Jack came over and placed a hand on her forehead. Hot, a fever. "Emma, what's wrong?" Jack asked anxiously. He lifted her into his arms and held her close. She rested her head on his shoulder, her little hand gripping his shirt. "Mummy, Mummy," she murmured weakly, her small voice full of longing. Jack felt as though an invisible hand had tightened around his heart. "Sweetheart, Mummy isn't here," he said softly. "Daddy's here with you." But Emma kept calling out, "Where's Mummy? Mummy?" Jack held her tighter, pacing the room, trying to soothe her. But Emma continued to cry, not loudly, not hysterically, but in soft, broken sobs filled with longing. She didn't understand why her mother was gone. She only knew that something had changed, and she wanted things to be the way they were before. Jack sank down onto the floor, holding Emma, his eyes drifting toward the window. The rain kept falling, heavier now. The grey sky mirrored his mood. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," Jack whispered, his voice thick. "I tried my best. I kept the house for you. I got custody. But I can't give you what you need most, a whole family." Emma looked up at him, tears clinging to her lashes. "Daddy." Jack hugged her tighter, tears threatening to spill, though he fought them back. "I know I can't replace your mother. I'm just a clumsy man who doesn't know how to sing lullabies or tell fairy tales. But I love you, Emma. I love you more than anything in this world." Emma rested her head against his chest, her crying gradually softened. Jack's heartbeat was steady, like a rough but honest lullaby. Slowly, Emma stopped crying, leaving only her uneven breathing. Jack stayed there, his back against the wall, holding her. He watched the rain trail down the glass and felt himself slowly unravel along with it. That night, after Emma fell asleep, Jack sat alone in the darkness. He didn't turn on the lights. He just sat there in silence, letting his thoughts surge. He had fought on the battlefield, faced danger, survived brutal trials, but no battle was harder than watching his daughter cry for her mother while he stood powerless. Money? He could earn it. Justice? He had won it. But Emma's happiness? That wasn't something he could buy or fight for. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. Lydia's name was still there. He wanted to delete it, but he couldn't, because no matter what, she was still Emma's mother. And maybe Emma needed her. Jack typed a message. "Emma has a fever. She's asking for you. If you want to see her, I'll arrange it." He hit send and set the phone down. He didn't know how Lydia would respond, but he knew he had to do this. Not for Lydia, for Emma. A few minutes later, the phone vibrated. A message from Lydia. "Thank you. I'm coming right now." Jack looked at the message and exhaled slowly. He didn't know if this was the right decision, but when he imagined Emma's face lighting up at the sight of her mother, he knew he couldn't say no. The next morning, Lydia arrived. She wore a simple coat, her hair tied back neatly, her face worn and pale. As soon as she stepped inside, her eyes searched for Emma. Jack stood beside the crib and lifted Emma up. She still had a mild fever, but she was awake. When she saw Lydia, her eyes lit up. "Mummy," she cried, reaching out. Lydia rushed forward, tears streaming down her face. My baby." Jack handed Emma to her. The child wrapped her arms around her mother's neck, clutching her clothes. Lydia held her tightly and sobbed deep, broken sobs filled with regret and longing. Jack watched, his heart unsettled. He saw the bond between mother and child, something that, no matter what happened, could never be fully broken. "Thank you," Lydia said, her voice shaking. "Thank you for giving me this chance." Jack nodded but said nothing. He simply stood there, like a silent wall, protective, yet allowing the connection between mother and daughter to exist. And in that moment, Jack understood. Victory is not about taking everything. Victory is knowing when to hold on and when to let go. And above all, victory is putting your child's happiness above all else. Even though his heart still ached, still felt empty, he knew he was doing the right thing. For Emma. Always for Emma. The courtroom was small, fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over rows of hard wooden benches. Jack sat on the right, holding a thick folder of documents, evidence of Lydia's neglect, of her abandonment of Emma, of her reckless decision to place the family's assets into the hands of a con man. Everything was in his favor. His attorney, Sarah, sat beside him, her expression confident. "You'll win," she had told him earlier. Lydia sat on the left, alone. No lawyer, just a small handbag and trembling hands resting in her lap. Her face was drawn, dark circles under her eyes, like someone who hadn't slept for nights on end. She didn't dare look at Jack. Her gaze stayed fixed on the floor, as though she were carrying the weight of an entire world of guilt on her shoulders. The judge, a grey-haired man with a stern expression, tapped his gavel lightly. "Court is now in session. The matter of child custody between Mr. Jack Reynolds and Mrs. Lydia Reynolds." Jack straightened, his hand resting on the folder. It felt as though a heavy stone was pressing against his chest. Sarah rose and began her presentation. She spoke of Lydia leaving the family, of her transferring assets to Eric without informing Jack, of her irresponsibility as a mother. Each word landed like an arrow aimed straight at Lydia. She sat there, her shoulders trembling, but she did not argue back. When it was Lydia's turn to speak, she stood, her voice shaking. "Your Honor, I know I was wrong. I was blind. I lost myself. I'm not asking to defend my actions, but I am asking for a chance to be a mother again." The judge looked at her, then turned to Jack. "Mr. Reynolds, based on this evidence, you have the right to request the complete termination of Mrs. Lydia's parental rights. Do you wish to do so?" The courtroom fell silent. All eyes turned to Jack. Sarah looked at him and gave a slight nod, an encouraging signal to say yes, but Jack didn't answer right away. He looked at Lydia. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face, uncontrolled. She wasn't hiding them, wasn't trying to appear strong. She was simply a mother in pain over her own mistakes. And in that moment, Jack remembered something. The day Emma had a fever, when Lydia held her, the look in her eyes, full of love and regret. That wasn't the look of an uncaring mother. It was the look of someone who had lost her way, but still loved her child. Jack stood up. "Your Honor, my daughter needs her mother." Sarah startled and turned toward him. "Jack, you—" But Jack raised a hand, signaling her to stop. He looked straight at the judge. "I do not want Lydia's parental rights terminated, but I do have conditions." The judge nodded. "Go on." Jack took a deep breath. "Lydia must attend a counseling program for 6 months. She must demonstrate financial and emotional stability. During that time, she may only see Emma under supervision. After 6 months, if she has truly changed, we can reconsider shared custody." Lydia looked up, her eyes filling with hesitant hope. "Jack, you—" Jack didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the judge. "Emma needs a family. Even if that family is no longer whole, she still needs both her father and her mother. I don't want my daughter to grow up carrying the pain of losing her mother." The judge made a few notes, then nodded. "This is a wise decision, Mr. Reynolds. I will approve these conditions. Mrs. Lydia, you have 6 months to prove yourself. Do not waste this opportunity." Lydia nodded, tears still falling. "Thank you, Your Honor, and thank you, Jack." After the hearing, Jack stood in the hallway, leaning against the wall. Sarah approached him, her expression puzzled. "Jack, do you know what you just did? You could have had everything." Jack nodded. "I know, but I don't want everything. I want Emma to have the best life possible." Sarah sighed. "You're too kind, Jack." Jack gave a faint smile. "It's not kindness. I've learned something. Hatred only creates more suffering. And I don't want Emma to grow up in a world filled with hatred. Sarah nodded and placed a hand on his shoulder. You did the right thing. That evening, Jack returned home and lifted Emma into his arms. She grinned widely, her little hand patting his cheek. Daddy? Jack hugged her tightly and kissed her forehead. I did something today, sweetheart. I don't know if it was the right decision, but I hope that one day, when you're grown, you'll understand. Emma tilted her head, looking at him with wide, curious eyes. Jack laughed softly and brushed her hair. I'm saying that I love you, and I'll do anything to make you happy even if it means setting my pride aside. He set Emma down on the floor and let her play with her wooden blocks. He thought about his decision. Had he been too merciful? Was he taking a risk by giving Lydia another chance? But then he remembered the look on Emma's face when she saw her mother, the brightness, the joy, and he knew he had done the right thing. A soldier knows how to fight, but a true soldier also knows when to lay down his weapon. And for Jack, letting go of hatred was not weakness. It was the greatest strength of all, the strength of forgiveness. A few days later, Lydia called. Her voice was soft, hesitant. Jack, I've enrolled in the counseling program. I'll do my best. Jack was silent for a moment, then replied, Good, do it for Emma. I know. And Jack, thank you. You gave me a chance when I didn't deserve one. Jack exhaled slowly. It's not about whether you deserve it. It's about Emma deserving a mother. Don't let her down. I won't, Lydia said, her voice steadier now. Jack ended the call and looked out the window. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky a warm shade of orange. He felt as though a burden had been lifted, not completely gone, but lighter. A year passed, like the gentle turning of book pages. Autumn gave way to winter, winter softened into spring, and summer came again. The small house was no longer filled with the heavy silence it once knew. Emma's laughter rang out every morning, like sunlight slipping through every crack. Jack stood by the stove, preparing Emma's milk. His hands no longer trembled the way they had in the beginning. He knew exactly how many scoops, what temperature, how many seconds to shake it evenly. The motions had become instinct. Emma sat in her high chair, her legs swinging back and forth, her eyes fixed on her father with eager anticipation. Daddy, milk. Jack smiled and handed her the bottle. Here you go, sweetheart. Hold it tight. Emma grabbed the bottle, drank greedily, then broke into a wide grin. A new day had begun. No battlefield, no deafening noise, just a child's laughter and the steady, peaceful rhythm of life. In the afternoon, Jack took Emma to the park. She toddled unsteadily across the grass, her arms raised, trying to catch the butterflies fluttering around. Jack followed a few steps behind, his pace slow, his eyes never leaving her. The observational skills of a soldier once used to detect danger were now focused on Emma's every movement. He noticed she preferred running to the right rather than the left. He noticed how much she liked the yellow of sunflowers. He noticed how she always looked up whenever a bird flew overhead. Daddy, look! Emma pointed at the sky, her voice full of excitement. Bird flying? Jack crouched down and pulled her into his arms. Yes, sweetheart. The birds fly beautifully, don't they? Emma nodded, her eyes shining. I want to fly too. Jack laughed and lifted her up, letting her fly like an airplane. Emma giggled, her arms stretched wide like wings. Higher, Daddy! Higher! Jack spun around, Emma soaring through the air, her laughter ringing like silver bells. And in that moment, Jack felt the nightmares that had once haunted him, the images that used to grip his mind slowly begin to fade. They didn't disappear entirely, but they no longer dominated him the way they once had. Because now, he had something better to think about. He had Emma. He had her laughter. And that was the most powerful healing medicine of all. That evening, there was a knock at the door. Jack opened it to find Clara standing outside, holding a bag of treats. I brought cookies for Emma. Jack smiled. You're spoiling her again. Clara laughed. She deserves it. Over the past year, Clara had become a natural part of their lives. Nothing rushed, nothing forced. Just presence, a friend, an ally, and perhaps something a little more than that. Emma ran over, arms raised. Auntie Clara. Clara bent down and lifted her up. How are you doing, sweetheart? Emma nodded, her little hands clutching Clara's hair. I'm great. Jack watched them, his heart warm. Clara never tried to replace Lydia. She was simply herself, kind, patient, and always there when they needed her. The three of them sat together in the living room. Emma played with puzzle pieces while Clara helped her assemble a rabbit. Jack sat nearby, watching them. feeling as though he were witnessing a picture slowly coming together, not the picture he once imagined, but one that was beautiful in its own way. "Jack," Clara said gently, "you seem happier now." Jack nodded. "I think I am. I've learned to live with what happened, and I've learned that happiness isn't about having everything perfect, it's about appreciating what you have." Clara smiled. "You've changed a lot, Jack." Jack looked at Emma, his eyes soft. She taught me how to love unconditionally, how to forgive, how to live." Late that night, after Clara had gone home, Jack laid Emma in her bed. She was tired, her eyelids heavy. Jack sat beside her and sang a lullaby, his voice still not melodic, but warmer now. "Sleep, my child. Daddy's here. Your dreams are safe within my care. No matter what storms tomorrow brings, I'll still be here, holding you close." Emma closed her eyes, her little hand gripping Jack's finger. Her breathing evened out, her face peaceful. Jack looked at her, his heart overflowing. A year earlier, he had been a broken man, unsure where his path led. Now, he knew. He didn't need a map or a compass. He only had to look at his daughter's face to know he was heading in the right direction. He kissed Emma's forehead and whispered, "Thank you, Emma. You saved me. You taught me how to become a better man." He turned off the light and stepped out. Standing in the hallway, he looked out the window. The night sky was full of stars, glittering like small, fragile hopes. The next morning, Jack woke to Emma's voice. "Daddy, I'm hungry." He went into her room and lifted her up. "I'll make your milk right away." But when he looked at her mouth, he paused. Something was different. He looked closer and then broke into a broad smile. "Sweetheart, you got a tooth." Emma opened her mouth, revealing a tiny white tooth. "A tooth?" Jack laughed and hugged her tightly. "Yes, your first tooth. Daddy has to remember this day." He took a picture of Emma and sent it to Clara and to Lydia as well, who had changed significantly after 6 months of counseling and was now seeing Emma more often. Lydia called back immediately. "Emma got her first tooth already? She's growing so fast." Jack smiled. "Yes, she's growing every day." "Thank you for sharing this with me," Lydia said sincerely. "Because you're Emma's mother," Jack replied. The small house was filled with color. Pink and light blue balloons floated along the ceiling. Ribbons were wrapped around the staircase, and a princess-shaped cake sat at the center of the table. Today was Emma's 3rd birthday. Jack stood in the kitchen, arranging paper plates and plastic cups. He wore a crisp white shirt, his hair neatly styled, a man who had learned to take better care of himself. Clara stood beside him, helping cut sandwiches into star shapes. "Are you nervous?" Clara asked gently. Jack nodded. "Lydia is coming. This is the first time we'll all be in the same space after everything that happened." Clara placed a hand on his shoulder, a comforting gesture. "You did the right thing inviting her. Emma needs to see that her parents can coexist for her sake." Jack looked at Clara, warmth softening his expression. Thank you for always being here," Clara smiled. "I'm here because I want to be, Jack, not out of obligation." There was something in the way she said it, her tone, her eyes, that made Jack's heart beat a little faster. But he said nothing. Not today. Today was Emma's day. The door opened, and Lydia stepped inside. She wore a light floral dress, her hair neatly tied back, a pink gift box in her hands. Her face looked healthier now, no longer worn as before. 6 months of counseling and steady work had helped her find herself again. "Hello," Lydia said shyly. "I hope I'm not late." Jack shook his head. "No, you're right on time. Emma's in the living room." Lydia walked in, her eyes searching for her daughter. Emma was sitting on the rug, playing with dolls. When she saw her mother, her eyes lit up. "Mummy!" Emma cried, toddling toward her. Lydia knelt down and opened her arms. Emma wrapped her arms around her mother's neck, grinning. "Did you come to play with me?" Lydia nodded, tears threatening to spill but held back. "Yes, Mommy came to celebrate your birthday." Jack watched from a distance, his heart stirred. The scene, mother and daughter reunited, was both sweet and bittersweet, but he knew it was right. Emma needed this. Clara stepped up and rested a hand on Jack's shoulder. "Are you okay?" Jack nodded. "I am. I'm just happy that Emma's happy." The party unfolded warmly. Lydia, Jack, Clara, and Emma sat around the table. They sang "Happy Birthday," Emma beaming as her eyes fixed on the flickering candles. "Make a wish," Jack said. Emma thought for a moment, then said, "I wish everyone is happy." Jack, Lydia, and Clara all laughed. A simple, Innocent wish, perfectly fitting for a 3-year-old. Blow out the candles, sweetheart, Lydia said softly. Emma blew, the candles went out, and everyone applauded. Emma giggled, her cheeks glowing pink. They cut the cake, ate, and talked. The atmosphere wasn't tense, as Jack had feared. It was warm, almost peaceful. Lydia talked about her new job as an accountant at a small company. Clara shared details about a new project she was working on. Jack listened, chiming in now and then, while Emma sat on his lap, scattering cake crumbs everywhere. "Thank you," Lydia said quietly when she and Jack stood together in the kitchen, away from Emma and Clara. Jack looked at her calmly. "Not for you, Lydia, for Emma. She needs to see that even if her parents aren't together anymore, we still love her." Lydia nodded, tears rolling down her cheeks. Jack sighed. "You're doing well, Lydia. Keep it up." That evening, after Lydia had left, Jack, Clara, and Emma sat in the living room. Emma rested her head against Jack's chest, her eyes growing heavy after an exciting day. "Daddy," Emma whispered, "can you read me a story?" Jack smiled. "Of course. Which one do you want?" Emma pointed to a fairy tale book on the table. Jack picked it up and opened the first page. It was a story about a princess and a dragon. "Once upon a time," Jack read in a warm, steady voice, "there was a fierce dragon guarding a castle. Everyone was afraid of it." Emma listened closely, her eyes fixed on the pictures, but when Jack reached the words fierce dragon, she paused and looked up at him. "Daddy, who is the bad person?" Jack stopped. The question seemed simple, but it carried deeper meaning. He set the book down and pulled Emma into his arms. "Sweetheart, bad people aren't born bad. Bad people are those who forget the way home." Emma tilted her head, curious. "Forget the way home?" Jack nodded. "Yes, they get lost. They forget what's right and what's wrong. But if someone helps them find the way back, they can return, and once they're home, they're not bad anymore." Emma thought for a moment, then asked, "Did Mommy forget the way home too?" Jack was surprised, but he didn't hide the truth. "Yes, Mommy forgot for a while, but she's found her way back now." Emma nodded, as if she understood. "I'm glad Mommy is back." Jack hugged her tightly and kissed her forehead. "So am I, sweetheart." Clara sat nearby, her eyes moist. She placed her hand over Jack's, a gentle but meaningful gesture. Late that night, after Emma was asleep, Jack and Clara sat on the porch swing. The sky was full of stars, a cool breeze passing through. "Today was beautiful," Clara said dreamily. Jack nodded. "I never thought things could be this peaceful. But they were." Clara turned to him. "You know, Jack, you're the bravest person I've ever met." Jack chuckled softly. "Brave? I'm just a clumsy guy trying to raise his kid." Clara shook her head. "No, courage isn't fighting on a battlefield or facing danger. Courage is forgiving someone who hurt you. It's opening your heart after it's been broken. It's believing in the future when the past is full of pain. And you've done all of that." Jack fell silent, deeply moved. He looked at Clara, the woman who had stood by him for 2 years, asking for nothing, only giving. "Clara," he said quietly, "thank you. Thank you for reminding me that life still has good things in it." Clara smiled and rested her head on his shoulder. "I didn't teach you anything. You learned it yourself, and Emma was your best teacher." Jack nodded, looking up at the sky. "Maybe so. She taught me that love isn't possession, it's letting go. And courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to love even when you know you might get hurt." They sat there in warm silence, and in that quiet night, Jack felt he had learned the most important lesson of his life. True courage doesn't live on the battlefield. It lives in the heart where we dare to love, dare to forgive, and dare to believe in tomorrow. 3 years passed like a calm, steady river. The small house now had a backyard, a place where Jack grew tomatoes, sunflowers, and hung a wooden swing from the branch of an old oak tree. Every morning, Emma's laughter rang out from that garden, like the rhythm of a new life. This morning, early sunlight spilled golden light across the porch. Jack stood by the window, a cup of coffee in his hand, looking outside. Emma, now 5 years old, was running across the grass, her hair flying in the breeze, her laughter like silver bells. Clara chased after her, pretending to be a monster, making Emma laugh until her sides hurt. "Aunt Clara, you can't catch me," Emma shouted, circling the swing. Clara laughed, stretching her arms like claws. "The monster will catch the princess." Emma giggled and ran toward Jack. "Daddy, save me." Jack set his coffee down and opened his arms. Emma rushed into them, holding him tight. "Daddy, protect me." Jack laughed and lifted her high. Daddy will protect his princess. Clara walked over, slightly out of breath but still smiling. The king saved the princess, the monster lost. Emma clapped her hands, beaming. Daddy is the best. Jack set Emma down and gently smoothed her hair. His eyes were soft, full of pride. Come on, sweetheart. Let's go inside for breakfast. Emma ran into the house, Clara following behind. Jack lingered for a moment, looking out at the garden. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, scattering shimmering patches of light. He took a deep breath, feeling the fresh air fill his lungs. This was the dawn of a new day, and he was grateful for every morning like this. In the kitchen, Clara was warming milk for Emma. Jack prepared toast, spreading butter and jam. They moved in easy rhythm, like a team long accustomed to working together. Emma sat in her high chair, her legs swinging, singing a little song she had learned in kindergarten. Mommy is coming today. Right, Daddy? Emma asked, her eyes bright. Jack nodded. Yes, Mommy will pick you up this afternoon and take you to the park. Emma clapped her hands. I like going to the park with Mommy. Jack smiled. Lydia now had a stable life, a good job, a small apartment, and most importantly, a healthy relationship with Emma. She visited every week. No longer hesitant or unsure, she and Jack had learned to respect each other not because they still loved one another, but because they both loved the same child. Jack's phone vibrated. A message from Lydia. I'll be there at 3 p.m. Thank you for always being supportive. Jack typed back. No problem. Emma is very excited. He set the phone down and looked at Emma. She was eating her toast, butter smeared on her cheeks. Jack wiped her face gently and chuckled. Try to eat a little more carefully, okay? Emma grinned. Yes, Daddy. That afternoon, Lydia arrived. She wore a light jacket, her hair in a ponytail, her face bright and relaxed. Emma ran toward her with arms raised. Mummy! Lydia bent down and hugged her. My sweetheart, Mummy missed you so much. Emma wrapped her arms around her mother's neck. I missed you too. Jack stood in the doorway watching them. Clara stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his. It's a beautiful sight, isn't it? Jack nodded. Yes, it took me a long time to accept this, but now I'm glad Emma has both her father and her mother. Lydia stood up and looked at Jack and Clara. Thank you, both of you. Thank you for giving me the chance to be a mother again. Jack nodded. You earned that chance, Lydia. You've changed. Lydia smiled, warmth in her eyes. It's because of you. You taught me that forgiveness is stronger than hatred. Then she took Emma's hand, and the two of them disappeared down the street. Jack watched them go, his heart at peace. The next morning, Jack woke early and stepped out onto the porch to watch the sunrise. The first light streamed through the trees, bathing the garden in gold. Birds sang, like a welcoming song for the new day. Emma stepped outside, her eyes still sleepy. Daddy, I'm awake. Jack turned and smiled. Good morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep well? Emma nodded and ran into his arms. Jack lifted her up and walked into the garden. They stood beneath the swing, looking up at the sky. Sunlight fell over the two of them, creating a warm, quiet picture. Daddy, Emma asked curiously, are you happy? Jack looked at her, his heart full. Yes, sweetheart. I'm very happy. Because I have you. Because I have a family. Emma smiled and hugged his neck. I'm happy too. Jack held her close and closed his eyes. He felt the warmth of the sun, heard the birds, and felt the steady heartbeat of his daughter against his chest. The wounds of the past were still there, they never fully disappeared. But they no longer ached with every change of season. They were simply part of him now, reminders of the road he had traveled. And most importantly, he had learned this. Coming home is not about geography. Coming home is finding peace within your soul. It is knowing that no matter how hard life becomes, you are loved. It is knowing that a child's love can mend even the deepest cracks. Jack opened his eyes and looked at Emma. Sweetheart, Daddy wants to tell you something. Yes, Daddy? I love you, and no matter what happens, I will always be here to protect you. Emma nodded and grinned. I know you love me, and I love you too. Jack laughed and lifted Emma high into the air. She reached out as if trying to touch the sun. Her laughter rang out, clear and bright like a bell. And in that moment, Jack knew he had truly come home. Not to a house of brick and concrete, but to a home in the heart where love lives, where forgiveness heals wounds, and where hope blooms with every sunrise. And that was the greatest victory of all for the soldier, Jack Reynolds. Jack's story is not about a hero fighting on a battlefield. It is the story of a man who learned to fight his own inner battles with pain, with hatred, with deep wounds. And in the end, he did not win with guns or bullets, but with love. Because sometimes, the greatest courage is not facing an enemy. It is having the courage to forgive, to love, and to believe in tomorrow.